Hello everyone. Today I wanted to do a book review on an oldie but a goodie, and that is People of the Lie. And I will pop up a photo, and this is by M. Scott Peck, MD, national bestseller of The Road Less Traveled. So, people who are evil attack others instead of facing their own failures. In this long overdue discussion between psychology and religion, Dr. M. Scott Peck demonstrates the havoc these people of the lie cause in the lives of those around them. Using vivid examples from cases encountered and or treated in his psychiatric practice, Dr. Peck probes the essence of human evil in everyday life. So this book opens with the case of George, a 34-year-old salesman who was handsome, articulate, and had a gift for telling stories. George had also made a pact with the devil. The trouble began on his last day of a sightseeing at a cathedral in Montreal. George had attended a business convention and brought his wife Gloria along to see the autumn foliage. Neither George nor his wife were particularly religious, but they were out sightseeing and decided to go inside and look around in the church. On their way out, George spotted a donation box and was racked with indecision. On the one hand, he had no genuine desire to donate any money to this church, but on the other hand, he felt an unreasonable fear that he might be jeopardizing the stability of his life if he didn't donate. But then it occurred to George it would be rational to contribute a small amount, just like an admissions fee for a museum. He decided to give the change in his pocket, which totaled 55 cents. That was the moment when the first thought hit him like a physical blow. You are going to die at 55. George took out his wallet, grabbed a $5 and two $1 bills, and stuffed them in the donation box. He practically shoved Gloria through the door on the way out. The incident was soon forgotten, and George and Gloria flew home the next day. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, George passed a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit sign, and another thought came to him. You will die at 45. Soon it wasn't just the signs with numbers that were affecting him. A strong thought came when he passed a sign for the town of Upton, North Carolina. You will be murdered by a man named Upton. These thoughts were coming nearly every day. George was preoccupied, had lost his sense of humor, and was having trouble sleeping at night. Even so, this was all still bearable until he drove over the bridge for the Roanoke River. Immediately afterward, he had the thought, that's the last time you will ever cross this bridge. That night, George couldn't sleep. The bridge across the Roanoke was one of his most traveled routes. He could not let his life be dictated by thoughts, especially since they weren't real. But how did he know they weren't real? That's when George came up with a plan. If he could go back over the Roanoke Bridge and not die, it would prove the thought to be false. George got dressed, drove 73 miles to the bridge, crossed it, came back home, and went to bed feeling better than he had in a long time because he proved the thought wrong. The relief lasted for 3 nights. The pattern of George's illness became more fixed and devastating. Every few days on the road, he would have a new thought about his death. Following the thought, his anxiety would reach an unbearable level. At that point, he would feel compelled to drive back to the spot where the thought about his possible death would occur to prove the thought wrong. Once he had proved the thought wrong, George felt fine until a new thought occurred. George made it 6 more weeks before seeking help. Every other night he was driving across the Carolina countryside. He slept less, lost 15 pounds, and his work performance suffered. He finally broke down weeping and told his wife what was happening. Gloria knew Dr. Peck from a mutual friend, and George started treatment. Dr. Peck explained to George that he was suffering from a classic obsessive-compulsive neurosis, that the thoughts that bothered him were what psychiatrists called obsessions, and that the need to return to the scene of the thought was a compulsion. George was concerned that he was going crazy, But Dr. Peck explained that other people experience similar compulsions, such as people who have great difficulty leaving their homes to go on vacation because they keep worrying about whether or not they locked all the doors and keep returning to their homes. George's response to hearing this was, "That's great. You mean I'm just like everybody else?" Dr. Peck then says, "No, George, you're not like everybody else. You're up all night being driven around by your compulsions. You have a major neurosis that is crippling your life. The cure, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is going to take quite a bit of time. Failure to get treatment will result in a continuous crippled state." When George returned for his second visit with Dr. Peck, he was a different man, radiating confidence and aplomb. George gave a superficial listing of his concerns outside of his little obsessions, which were his oldest daughter needing braces, whether or not to paint the house, the grades of his middle child who was more interested in sports, and that he secretly loved his youngest child, 6-year-old Christopher, the best. George said that his marriage and or sex life was fine. His father had a nervous breakdown when he was 9 years old. His mother, despite being a touch overly religious, was a good mom and spent a lot of time with him and his sister, and that the family spent a lot of time with his maternal grandparents, and he was especially close to his grandmother. George then told Dr. Peck that he hadn't had an obsessive-compulsive thought since their first appointment, and he didn't feel as if he needed any additional therapy. Dr. Peck tried to remonstrate with George, as it didn't seem that anything substantial had changed in his life. However, he wasn't going to argue with George and told him that he would be happy to see him again whenever he wanted to. 2 days later, George called back after he was hounded by a thought that when he rounded a curve, he had struck and killed a hitchhiker. George resumed treatment, and Dr. Peck gradually learned that George and Gloria's marriage was abysmal. They only had sex once every 6 weeks or so when both of them were drunk. Gloria was significantly depressed and saw George as a weak, sniveling slob, and George held an enormous amount of resentment towards Gloria, whom he saw as self-centered, unloving, and totally unsupportive. George was alienated from his 2 oldest children, and in the whole family only had a relationship with his youngest son, Christopher. Dr. Peck also realized his childhood had been more frightening and damaging than George liked to believe. His father became unpredictable and violent before his mental breakdown that caused him to be admitted to the state hospital, where he later died. George's mother was extremely religious, and he hated the Pentecostal church she took him to every Wednesday and Friday evening, plus all day on Sunday. He was also embarrassed by his mother speaking in tongues and writhing in religious ecstasy during the services. While George did have a warm relationship with his grandmother, his grandfather beat his grandmother almost weekly, and George was terrified he was going to kill her. George repeatedly complained that he did not see the point in talking about the problems of his past and wanted to focus exclusively on his obsessions and compulsions. It became clear to Dr. Peck that George was using his symptoms to avoid dealing with the realities of his life. Dr. Peck told George that until he quit using his obsessions and compulsions as a smokescreen and actually dealt with his miserable marriage and ghastly childhood, his symptoms would only get worse. Despite not wanting to deal with his issues, George was in a hurry to be relieved of his symptoms. He started calling Dr. Peck from the road when he was experiencing them. George would explain something along the lines that he had promised Gloria he would be home on time for dinner, but that he had one of his thoughts, and if he returned to where the thought occurred, he would be late getting home. George would then ask Dr. Peck to tell him he couldn't go back. Each time, Dr. Peck would explain that he was not going to tell George what to do, that only George had the power to make those decisions, and it was not healthy for George to want Dr. Peck to make the decisions for him. George never understood Dr. Peck's response and saw it as a cruelty and unwillingness to help. And so it went for many more weeks. George became weepy, lost more weight, and developed diarrhea. Dr. Peck was worried that George might have to be hospitalized. But then something changed. A little less than 4 months after George started therapy, George came to his appointment whistling, and he was cheerful. He told Dr. Peck he hadn't had a compulsion in over 4 days. George spoke with Dr. Peck about his issues, but without any real feeling. Just before the end of the session, George asked Dr. Peck if he believed in the devil. George wouldn't answer as to why he brought it up, so Dr. Peck left it alone. George had 2 more sessions where he was feeling well, no longer looked haggard, had gained weight, and explained that he was not giving in to his compulsions. George was getting better, but Dr. Peck couldn't figure out why, as George was still reluctant to make more than a superficial effort in therapy. On the 3rd session of George's improvement, he told Dr. Peck that he had a confession to make. George then said that because Dr. Peck wasn't helping to prevent George from going back to the spots where his thoughts came from, he had to do something to keep himself from giving in to his compulsions. So he made a pact with the devil that if he gives in to his compulsions, the devil would see to it that the thoughts came true. However, George also admitted that he was feeling a bit of the guilties because people aren't supposed to make pacts with the devil. However, George didn't really believe in the devil, and the pact seemed to be working, so no big deal, right? George asked what Dr. Peck thought, but Dr. Peck asked for some time to think before responding. George then added that there was another reason he felt guilty. Because he didn't really believe in the devil, he couldn't be certain that the pact would work, so George made it part of the agreement that if he gave in to his compulsions to go back, the devil would see to it that his son Christopher would die an early death. That's why the pact was working, as George wasn't willing to risk Christopher's life. Dr. Peck was hesitant to give George his opinion because after a mere 4 months of treatment, George and Dr. Peck had little in the way of a therapeutic relationship. Passing judgment on George seemed like a dangerous thing to do, but not saying anything seemed dangerous as well. When George asked Dr. Peck again what he thought, Dr. Peck told George that he was glad he was having the guilties and that he should feel guilty because he had done something to feel guilty about. Dr. Peck told George he would be worried about him if he didn't feel guilty. George questioned Dr. Peck by saying, "I thought psychotherapy was supposed to relieve me of my guilt feelings." And Dr. Peck replied, "Only those guilt feelings that are inappropriate. To feel guilty about something that is not bad is unnecessary and sick. Not to feel guilty about something that is bad is also sick." George asked, "Do you think I'm bad?" To which Dr. Peck replied, "I think that in making this pact with the devil, you have done something that is bad, something evil." George became extremely upset, stating that he didn't believe in God and he didn't believe in the devil, so how could the pact be real? Besides, even if he did make a pact with the devil and it was real, in his mind the contract wasn't valid because it was made under duress, and any lawyer knows that a contract under duress is not a valid contract. It's null and void. In his response to George, the reader can tell Dr. Peck is exasperated. He says, "Of course it was made under duress. Why else would one contract with the devil except to rid themselves of suffering? The question is not duress, it's how one deals with duress. Some people overcome it ennobled. Some break and sell out. You sell out. And you do it rather easily. You're always looking for the easy way out, George. When you're faced with the choice between the right way and the easy way, you'll take the easy way every time. In fact, you'll do anything to find the easy way out, even if it means making a pact with the devil and sacrificing your son. You've been learning that psychotherapy is not the easy way out. If you're willing to face the painful realities of your life, your terror-filled childhood, your miserable marriage, your mortality, and your own cowardice, then I can help you, and I'm sure that we can succeed. But if all you want is the easiest possible relief from pain, then I expect you are the devil's man, and I don't see any way that psychotherapy can help you." George pointed out that once someone has sold their soul to the devil, there's no backing out. It might be too late. To which Dr. Peck said to George, "I don't know much about these things, but I can make an educated guess. I think you really did make a pact with the devil, and because you did, I think for you, the devil became real. In your desire to avoid pain, you called the devil into existence because you had the power to call him into existence. I think you also have the power to end his existence. Instinctively, in the deepest part of me, I feel the process is reversible. I think you can go back to where you were. I think that if you change your mind and become willing to bear the duress, then the pact will be voided and the devil will have to look elsewhere for someone to make him real. There are different ways to look at things. Psychiatrists are accustomed to understand human beings in terms of health and disease. George was suffering from a very specific disease, namely an obsessive-compulsive neurosis. In many ways, George's case was typical, including his propensity for magical thinking. This is basically a belief that thoughts in and of themselves may cause events to occur. Children are magical thinkers who often outgrow this unless they have been unduly traumatized. It was because George believed his thoughts would come to pass, which compelled him to travel back to the scene of the thoughts to nullify them. Looked at in this light, George's pact with the devil was simply another manifestation of his magical thinking. Since the problem can be understood in these terms, is there need for further analysis? What if the pact was viewed in terms of a traditional religious model? What was the meaning of George's pact? Just another neurotic symptom, or the crucial turning point of his existence with cosmic significance? When George told Dr. Peck about his pact with the devil, Dr. Peck had to make a choice, whether to regard the pact as a typical neurotic symptom or as a moment of moral crisis. Do nothing or throw himself with all the vigor he could muster into the moral fray. The concept of evil has been central to religious thought for millennia, yet it is virtually absent from our science of psychology. After the Galileo affair proved hurtful to both, science and religion worked out an unwritten social contract of non-relationship. In 1615, Galileo's writings on heliocentrism had been submitted to the Roman Inquisition by Father Niccolò Lorini, who claimed that Galileo and his followers were attempting to reinterpret the Bible, which was seen as a violation of the Council of Trent and looked dangerously like Protestantism. Galileo went to Rome to defend himself, but was ultimately put on house arrest. Religion agreed that the natural world was the sole province of the scientists, and science defined itself as value-free. So what is the purpose of this book? To encourage people to take human life so seriously that we also take human evil seriously. Serious enough to study it with all the means at our command, including the methods of science. The only valid reason to recognize human evil, according to Dr. Peck, is to heal it wherever we can, and when we cannot, to study it further, that we might discover how to heal it in specific instances and eventually wipe its ugliness off the face of the earth. There is another case in this book that introduces the reader to the concept of people of the lie. At one point in Dr. Peck's career, he held an administrative post, not practicing therapy, but seeing patients for consultations. This was a government job, and the people he saw were often high-ranking political figures. Thus he met Roger, a 15-year-old boy, whose grades were declining, who was depressed and clearly unhappy. Because Roger kept responding that everything in his life was all right, Dr. Peck decided to play a game with Roger he normally reserved for younger children. He handed Roger an ornamental vase, told him to pretend there was a genie inside and make 3 wishes. Roger wished for a stereo, a motorbike, then said something Dr. Peck didn't expect. He wished he could go to boarding school. Roger wouldn't really explain why he wanted to go to boarding school, so Dr. Peck said to him, maybe you need to get away from home then. Maybe there's something at home that's bothering you. Home's all right, Roger said, but there seemed to be a hint of fear in his voice. Dr. Peck asked if he told his parents he wanted to go to boarding school. Last fall, Roger said, whose voice had dropped to a whisper. Dr. Peck told Roger that that was courageous and asked what his parents' answer was. They said no, but Roger didn't know why. When Dr. Peck asked Roger how that made him feel, he said, "It's all right." Dr. Peck explained to Roger that he was going to speak with his parents and make some recommendations. Mr. and Mrs. R. were a handsome couple in their early 40s who were impeccably dressed. Dr. Peck asked them how they perceived Roger's problem, and while they shared that Roger had no difficulties with things like toilet training, peer relations, etc., Mr. and Mrs. R. had no ideas about why Roger's grades were declining. While Dr. Peck was finding it easy to interview Roger's parents as they were intelligent and sophisticated, he was beginning to become vaguely uneasy. He asked them if they had given any thought to the possibility of sending Roger away to boarding school. "No," Mr. R replied. "Of course we would if it was recommended, but that would be a costly solution. It's outrageous what those schools charge." After a small moment of silence, Dr. Peck said, "Roger told me that he asked you if he could go to boarding school last fall." "Did he?" Mr. R looked blank for a moment. Then Mrs. R jumped into the conversation and said, "Oh, you remember, dear, we considered it quite seriously at the time." Mr. R then claimed that when Dr. Peck asked, he was confused and thought Dr. Peck meant had they considered boarding school recently, which they had not because of Roger's grades. Mrs. R then said she thought so many children got sent to boarding school just because their parents didn't want them. She then asked, "I think children do best in a good, stable home. Don't you, Dr. Peck?" Mr. R chimed in and said maybe they should reconsider boarding school if Dr. Peck advised it, and he asked Dr. Peck if Roger's problems would be solved if they sent him away to school. Dr. Peck was torn. He sensed something wrong with Mr. and Mrs. R, but it was subtle. How could they have forgotten that their son asked to go to boarding school? Then they claimed to remember, but that was a lie. Dr. Peck was thinking there had to be something so wrong in the home that Roger wanted to go to boarding school, but he had no proof. Certainly, Dr. Peck could not guarantee that Roger's grades would improve or he would be happier at boarding school. Dr. Peck finally told Mr. and Mrs. R that Roger was depressed, he was not going to outgrow it, and changes needed to be made. He pointed out that children Roger's age do not lightly request to go to boarding school, but do instinctively seem to understand what is right for themselves, even if they can't always express it. Dr. Peck explained again that he only did consultations, and he referred them to a Dr. Levinson who specialized in psychological evaluation, testing, and psychotherapy of adolescents. Mr. R then asks if Levinson was a Jewish name, while Mrs. R stated she wasn't sure if she was comfortable with Roger seeing anyone but a psychiatrist. Dr. Peck stated that Dr. Levinson's credentials were impeccable, and any psychiatrist would also refer Roger to a psychologist for testing, and that psychologists were cheaper than psychiatrists. They finally took Dr. Levinson's information, but became alarmed when Dr. Peck wanted to speak with Roger one more time before they left. Mr. R actually said to Dr. Peck, "What business is it of Roger's what you recommend? After all, it's our decision. He's just a child." Dr. Peck told Mr. and Mr. R that Roger had a right to know what was happening to him, and assuming they took Roger to see Dr. Levinson, it was only fair to explain to him what to expect. Not to do so would be almost inhumane. Mrs. R finally agreed so they wouldn't be late to another function by continuing to discuss philosophical issues. Dr. Peck spoke with Roger, called Dr. Levinson to let him know he made the referral, but honestly expected no follow-through from Mr. and Mrs. R and never thought he would see Roger again. 7 months later, Mr. R called for a second consultation. He said that Roger's principal would be mailing Dr. Peck a letter, and they scheduled an appointment. Roger was now in Catholic school close to where he lived, and while his grades were still poor, about a C- average, he was well liked by his teachers and peers and was excelling in a community program where he volunteered after school to work with special needs children. It was even voted for him to attend a special education conference in New York City. However, in January, Roger and a classmate broke into the room of a retired priest and stole some of the priest's belongings. Normally, that kind of incident would result in immediate expulsion from the school, but several faculty took into account how depressed Roger was and wanted to know Dr. Peck's recommendation. Dr. Peck met with Roger again. He asked him if he liked Father Jerome, the priest he stole from. Roger answered that he was okay and often invited the students for tea and cookies, then added curiously, "I suppose I like him." Since Roger had no reasonable explanation for why he broke into the priest's room, Dr. Peck suggested that perhaps Roger was looking for more kindness. Dr. Peck then asked Roger if he ever saw Dr. Levinson. He wasn't surprised when Roger said no. He asked if Roger wanted to go to boarding school and was surprised when Roger said to him, "No, I want to stay at St. Thomas. Please, Dr. Peck, help me to stay at St. Thomas. Roger said he felt liked at the school. Dr. Peck reassured Roger that he was liked at the school and asked how the trip to New York was. Roger told Dr. Peck he didn't go to the special education conference. His parents didn't let him go because he didn't keep his room clean. When asked how it made him feel, Roger said, "All right." Dr. Peck was outraged. You get awarded an exciting trip to New York on your own merits and you're not allowed to go, but tell me it's all right? That's a load of crap. Dr. Peck theorized that Roger's anger and not being allowed to go on the trip caused Roger to break into Father Jerome's room. Dr. Peck asked Roger if he ever got angry with his parents. All Roger would say was, "They're all right." Dr. Peck then met with Roger's parents, who expressed fear that Roger was becoming a common criminal and said they should have taken him to see Dr. Levinson after all. When asked why they didn't follow up with Dr. Levinson, his parents replied that they were left with the impression that it was Roger's decision. And when Roger expressed no enthusiasm to see Dr. Levinson, they assumed he didn't want to go. Clever. With a few words, the issue of them not following through had become the fault of Roger and Dr. Peck. He asked them if they had any idea of why Roger stole. They had no idea, so Dr. Peck explained that stealing is an angry act and asked if they knew why Roger would be angry. Again, Mr. and Mrs. R were at a total loss. Dr. Peck brought up the special education conference. Mr. and Mrs. R were surprised that Roger was upset because he didn't seem upset when they told him he couldn't go. Dr. Peck explained that Roger had great difficulty expressing his emotions and asked why Roger wasn't allowed to go to New York. Mr. R explained that by not keeping his room clean, Roger was not fit to be an ambassador abroad when he couldn't keep his own house in order. Dr. Peck explained that not keeping a clean room did not seem like an adequate reason for preventing Roger from a trip he earned by his own efforts in a worthy field of endeavor. Mrs. R said gently and sweetly that they weren't sure it was right for Roger to work with retarded children, and some of them were mentally ill, too. Then Mrs. R asked if Dr. Peck still recommended boarding school. Dr. Peck said no, and that he felt it would be too traumatic on Roger to move schools now. Mr. and Mrs. R were not satisfied with that and asked if he had any other recommendations. Dr. Peck said yes, and that he would strongly recommend psychiatric treatment for both parents. Mr. and Mrs. R were amused by this and asked why. Dr. Peck replied that they seemed to lack empathy for Roger, and psychotherapy would be the only thing that might enable them to understand their child better. What ensued was a bizarre discussion where Mr. and Mrs. R spoke about an uncle in the family who was an alcoholic and hinted that Roger might have inherited some kind of defective gene. Dr. Peck then verbally cornered them and said, "You know, what strikes me about all this is that the two of you seem more eager to believe that Roger has an incurable illness, or more willing to write him off, than to believe that you yourselves may be in need of treatment." For a fraction of a second, Dr. Peck saw pure animal fear in their eyes, but within an instant, they recovered. 3 weeks later, Dr. Peck received a note from Mrs. R on her personal stationery, and it said, "Dear Dr. Peck, you were so kind to see us again last month at such short notice. My husband and I truly appreciate your concern for Roger. I wanted to let you know we have followed your advice and have sent Roger to boarding school. It is a military academy in North Carolina and has an excellent reputation for working with children with behavior problems. I am sure things will be better from now on. Thank you so much for all you have done for us. Very sincerely yours, Mrs. R." So, is this evil? Might we not say that Mr. and Mrs. R were remarkably insensitive people and leave it at that? The fact is, though, they were not insensitive people. They were highly intelligent and finely tuned to social nuances. They were well educated, gracious, politically sophisticated, quite adept in the committee and at the cocktail party. They could not have been who they were had they lacked sensitivity. Mr. R would not make an unconsidered legal decision. Mr. R was a lawyer. And Mrs. R would always remember to send flowers on the right occasion. But Roger they would not remember or consider. The fact is that their insensitivity toward him was selective. Conscious or unconscious, it was a choice. Why? Why should they make such a choice? Was it merely that they did not want to be bothered with Roger, and that all their reactions to him were predicated on what would be cheapest and easiest rather than on what he might need? Or did they actually, in some dark way, want to destroy him? If the reader reviewed the account of the interactions between Mr. and Mrs. R with Dr. Peck, they would find somewhere between 1 and 2 dozen lies. It is not a matter of one lie or two. Roger's parents lied to Dr. Peck repeatedly and routinely. They were people of the lie. The lies were not gross. There was not one that they would have been taken to court on, yet the process was pervasive. Indeed, even going to see Dr. Peck at all was a lie. Why did they seek Dr. Peck's services when they neither had any real concern for Roger or any real interest in Dr. Peck's advice? The answer is that it was part of the pretense. They wanted to appear as if they were trying to help Roger. Since it had been advised by his school, they would have seemed remiss had they not sought attention. Had they been asked, "You've taken him to a psychiatrist, haven't you?" they could answer, "Oh yes, several times, but nothing has seemed to help." Dr. Peck questioned why they brought Roger back a second time, especially knowing they had failed to follow any of his recommendations after the first visit. It seemed like an odd choice. But then he remembered that he had been very clear about the fact that he only did very brief consultations. This meant there could be no significant pressure on them to follow through on recommendations. Their escape route was wide open. Dr. Peck's schedule fitted the pretense. Naturally, since it's designed to hide its opposite, the pretense chosen by the evil is most commonly the pretense of love. The message Mr. and Mrs. R sought to convey was, because we are good, loving parents, we are deeply concerned about Roger. Dr. Peck says any experienced psychotherapist knows that unloving parents abound, and that the vast majority of such parents maintain at least some degree of a loving pretense. Surely they do not all deserve the designation of evil. Dr. Peck admits he doesn't know where to draw the line with Mr. and Mrs. R, but they had crossed it. There was the matter of the degree to which they were willing to sacrifice Roger for the preservation of their narcissistic self-image. There seemed to be no lengths to which they would not go. It bothered them not at all to think of him as a genetic criminal, to blandly offer him up to the designation of hopelessly incurable against Dr. Peck's suggestion that they themselves needed therapy. Dr. Peck sensed no limit to their willingness to use Roger as a scapegoat if necessary. Then there was also the degree, the depth, and distortion of their lying. Mrs. R had written, "I wanted to let you know that we have followed your advice and have sent Roger to boarding school." What an extraordinary statement. It says that Dr. Peck advised them to take Roger out of St. Thomas when he specifically advised against such action. It states they followed Dr. Peck's advice when they specifically did not. His primary advice was that they themselves have therapy. Finally, it implies that they did what they did because Dr. Peck advised it, when in fact they considered Dr. Peck's advice irrelevant. Not one lie, not even 2 lies, but 3 lies all twisted around each other in a single short sentence. Buber stated it well when he wrote of the uncanny game of hide and seek in the obscurity of the soul, in which it, the single human soul, evades itself, avoids itself, hides from itself. So this book has several more compelling stories of people who are involved in or may themselves be varying degrees of evil. I just think this is an important book to look at because people who are evil attack others instead of facing their own failures. And in this book, Dr. Peck demonstrates the havoc these people of the lie, as he calls them, cause in the lives of the people around them. So all of these cases are from his psychiatric practice. They are vivid, they are unforgettable, they are disturbing, and they are fascinating. And one of the things that I do like, especially in the last case, is Dr. Peck talks about the confusion that we experience when we are around someone who is quote unquote evil. So I think this is definitely, oops, one of my little bookmarks fell out. I think this is definitely a book worth checking out, especially if you are interested in the ongoing conversation of good and evil, and if there is anything that can be done about it, or the small ways you can call people out on it or protect yourself from it, and is worth giving a read to. I don't really have a rating system, 10 stars out of 10, 100 stars out of 100. This is a book that I have actually read more than once. I don't want to be embarrassed and tell you how many times I've read it, probably too many times by now. So unfortunately, I am getting over, I don't even know if I'm getting over this cold, this flu, walking pneumonia, who knows what it is. But my voice is giving out, so I am going to end this review now. If there is a book you would like me to do a review on, please let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.